Hello, my name is Lloyd Crooks, as you can see, and this is the second part of my talk about textual criticism. So, following on from last session, we're looking at in terms of the rules or significant rules. Now, I haven't done an exhaustive one of the rules, but those which actually impact modern textual criticism. So, the first person is Johann Albrecht Bengel. I hope I pronounced that right. This was published in 1735. And he said, although versions and fathers are of little authority where they differ from the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, yet where the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament differ from each other, those have the great authority which versions and fathers agree. It's also interesting that Bengel talks about the text of the Latin Vulgate, which supposed by the consent of the Latin fathers, or even of the competent witnesses, deserve the utmost consideration on account of its singular antiquity. So basically, just a quick recap, the Roman Empire was split into two. You had the Western and the Eastern, and he's giving greater support to the Latin witness and also to the Latin Vulgate. And it is interesting that the Latin Vulgate that was edited by Jerome had witnesses to sort of earlier Greek manuscripts. But what you find as we go along, this view was sort of not really taken on board in terms of modern textual criticism. And it's so in fine, more is not to prefer to fewer. Now, this is interesting. That so in fine, more is not to be preferred to fewer. And what is more important, which is differ in country, age, and language, are to be preferred to those who are closely connected with each other. And which is most important of all, ancients are to be preferred to modern ones, for since the original autographs and they were written in Greek can alone claim to be the wellspring, the amount of authority due to codices drawn from primitive sources, Latin, Greek, etc., depends upon their nearness to that fountainhead. So what is talking about is giving deference to the older manuscripts, but there seems to be an issue here because it talks about more witnesses and more diverse witnesses, which is basically common sense, really, when you think about it. That if you have rather than have a localized text, go for sort of wide witness. But here's the thing I wanted to say before I go into the about the canons. The difference with the Byzantine tradition is that they follow the same format off in terms of identifying the books of the Bible, right? In terms of the canons, yeah, what's canonical and what's not. That is almost like organically with the Byzantine tradition. It's almost organically that we have a body of text which has been adopted throughout the period of time and was copied up to the time of printing. And there didn't seem to be any rules as to define, yeah. Uh, they didn't say what is the actual true apostolic text. It's almost like through that stream, which we talked about in part one, is that there wasn't any rules. But here we see um, moving away from that tradition by introducing rules to identify what readings are close or identified with their apostolic writings. All right. So here we see Bengel. He didn't really seem to have so much influence on modern textual criticism, but he does draw out some interesting about the development of these rules. All right. So we see here Bengel, right? Now, this is the really key person is Griesbach, right? Now, people talk about Westcott and Hort. I'll talk about Westcott and Hort a bit later, but Westcott and Hort's influence was in terms of the Greek New Testament, which was quite popular when it was brought in 1981. But what you find is that Griesbach's rules or canons had the greatest influence and more adopted than Westcott and Hort in terms of his rules and his canons. So, for example, and he influenced, really, he's the grandfather of modern textual criticism. So, where I would say Westcott and Hort was the father, but the grandfather, really, the one whose canons or rules, and he had about 15 rules, and he was the one mentioned about the shorter reading. All right. Now, the more difficult and obscure. So basically, he's focusing on the internal rules of textual criticism. So you have the external rules, and then you have the internal rules in terms of scribal habits. Now, there's a lot of assumption in a sense when you talk about this. So he talks about the shorter reading, if not wholly lacking support for older weight witnesses, to be preferred over the more verbose. So what he was saying, scribes were more likely to add than to omit. So he actually said, and if you go along, you read Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, what you will find is that there was a deference to the shorter reading. So what he believed, right, that the shorter reading, because scribes more likely, and I'm going to go into this point a bit later. So the shorter reading is to be preferred. Now, what you find with the Alexandrian texts, the Egyptian texts, they were shorter than the Byzantine type readings. So there was they reckon there was three sort of main types: the Western, um, the Byzantine, and the Alexandrian. The Alexandrian was shorter, the Western was longer, and the Byzantine was sort of in the middle, so to speak. All right. But this is what he said about scribes. Then he says the more difficult and obscure reading is preferable to that which everything is so plain and free of problems that every scribe is easily able to understand. So what he's saying is that scribes are more likely to make the reading simple and easier. So they adjusted the text to make it simpler and easier, not so difficult. Yeah. The harsher readings preferable to that which flows pleasantly and smoothly in style. Right. So talking about the sort of terseness of the particular reading. The reading that in comparison with others proves a sense fit to the support of piety, especially monastic, is suspect. Now, this is probably the one that is most controversial and causes the most problems. That preferable to others is the reading from which the reading is apparently quite false. I really want to emphasize that point, quite false, which is in fact, after thorough examination, is discovered to be true. Now, all these relate to these really shape the internal criteria. And if you look in, especially Bruce Metzger's textual commentary, a lot of these have been adopted. Now, that last one about the falseness is being sort of refined a bit, but you'll see it how it works out practically with the decisions that are made. So basically, the textual critic will look at these rules and identify variant readings because you have 5,600, maybe 5,800 portions of the Greek New Testament, and there are differences. Some cannot be translated; they're non-translatable, so they don't really affect the actual uh, the Bible, so to speak. For example, they'd have a reading which says Jesus Christ and one says Christ Jesus. It's not really an issue. But what you find here is that the main difference with the Byzantine type is that there's no rules, so to speak. It's almost like the church has adopted this particular manuscript. Yes, there's differences, but what you find the big difference between the modern textual criticism and the Byzantine is that you have these issues comes up with regarding the readings, right? So Griesbach, his internal criteria is the most influential out for the textual critics of the old, right? Now, one of the things I want to bring out here is James Roysce. Now, his book, here's his book here, Scribal Habits in Early Greek New Testament Papyri. Now, one of the things which I've said before is that in the previous video is that although Griesbach introduced these textual canons, there was no evidence to support that. Now, that is quite significant and quite interesting. There was no evidence to support all these text canons, all these focus on the internal readings, right, and informs the decision to adopt what variant reading as opposed to another variant reading. So what you find here is that the first person really to do scribal habits was E.C. Cowell, based on singular readings, right? So basically, what singular readings were that they were peculiar to that particular scribe. So you wouldn't find that reading in any other manuscript, right? But they were peculiar singular readings. So that way they could identify the particular scribe over that particular papyri, that particular codex, and notice what was their behavior, what was their habits. Yeah. But it's interesting that there was no evidence. So here's what James Roysce said. Now, the thing about it's interesting that I believe this book was edited by Barber and Gonzaga. So this was his doctoral dissertation, and it was published by Brill, but it was actually edited by Bart Ehrman and Eldon J. Yap. So these were the top guys in terms of textual criticism. So this is what James Royce said. The fact that Griesbach does not even attempt to present evidence for his statements about how scribes copied makes it difficult, if not impossible, for later students to know what exactly he would have considered as evidence, to check the evidence upon which his statements rest, or to revise his statements in the light of new evidence provided by subsequent manuscript discoveries. The difficulty becomes exasperated when one turns to those variations where the different canons conflict one with another. All right. And when one deals with issues on which competent scholars disagree as a result of the lack of clear evidence on scribal habits, many decisions about specific textual problems, and I really want to labor this point, appear arbitrary and subjective. This doesn't even apply to the textual commentary published by Metzger, because this matters, this commentary, as explanation and justification of the various decisions made in the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament. And that's from his book, Early Scribal Habits. So basically, just in a nutshell, is that he provided no evidence. Now, whatever people may argue in terms of modern textual critics, is that there's no evidence. So what's happened is that the work that began by E.C. Cowell with three early papyri, and he went right to the beginning. There was a reason why he went to the earliest, and hopefully someone will take on the work and trace it right through. Is that James Royce? He looked into six early papyri, all right, and then what happened was there was other people afterwards, like Juan Hernandez Jr. He did one on the Apocalypse, looking at the main codexes, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Ephraim. And then you had Maurice Robinson. He did one, I believe, on the Apocalypse, on early scribal habits, following that same principle of single reading. And Peter Head, and I believe there was a main one by Andrew Wilton. Now, his one was quite large because he actually looked at papyri, minuscules, majuscules, lectionaries. He looked at 2,280 singular readings, but we're going to go into that later. So it's important to know that these canons, and I don't want to sound blunt, but I will, they were just made up with no evidence. So even if you did not have these scholarly studies, there was no evidence to support these internal evidence canons, right? So what you find is on the back, especially James Royce's doctoral dissertation, you find a lot of scholars, Peter Head, I think Peter Head is another one, came along using that same format and looking at papyri, minuscules, majuscules, lectionaries, and they came up with the same conclusion. But I'll hold that point, what the conclusion was. So you had Westcott and Hort rules in 1881, coming about the time when they introduced the Greek New Testament. Now, they're very influential because basically the Greek New Testament, what they produced, right, was the standard, and there's very little difference between the Greek New Testaments in its various editions, the Nestle-Aland, the United Bible Society, very hardly any difference really. Yeah, right. So they introduced a few more canons, but the real person was Griesbach. When it says older rings manuscripts are to be preferred, the shorter the interval between the time of the autographs, so they had deference to the older manuscripts. The reading is less likely to be original. That shows a disposition to smooth away difficulties. So that's riding on the back of Griesbach, that scribes might more like to make the text smoother and nicer and easier. Yeah. Readings are to be preferred that are found in a manuscript that habitually contains superior readings as determined by intrinsic and transcriptional probability. Certainty is increased if a much better manuscript is found to be an older manuscript. So you're seeing here automatically a difference to the manuscripts found in Egypt, all right, or their history is in Egypt, all right. So basically, if you look at the majority of manuscripts, right, which are a lot older, right? But the danger is that you may be looking at just a localized text, localized to that particular region. And this is why Bengal brought out the point that best to have more, right, and more diverse over diverse areas. And that would sort of give you an idea what the true apostolic manuscript is. But their contribution, an interesting thing about Westcott and Hort, um, it was said that one called the vile Textus Recepticus, right? And what you find with Westcott and Hort is that they focused on unprinted, previously printed um, uh, Greek texts, right? They weren't really collators or scholars of the actual manuscripts, the actual the hard evidence itself. So during that time, you had guys like FHA Scrivener, who was a really influential textual scholar. He was involved in the Revised Standard Version translation, but also he's basically the one, the compiler of the Greek printed Greek texts behind the King James Version. So Scribner's 8 printed Greek Textus Recepticus is the one that most traditional scholars use. And when I say traditional, I brought that a traditional text. All right. So he was a great scholar, FHA Scrivener, and I'm sure you can get hold of his book, Introduction to in terms of the New Testament, and also a man called, he's probably been not really treated favorably in history, but was a great scholar, and that was Dean John Burgon. Right, he was a man who looked at the original manuscripts themselves, the Codex Sinaiticus, Sinaiticus. He'd look at it, inspect it, look at it. Guys like Herman Hoskier. So, but you find with Westcott and Hort, they focus on the printed, previously printed Greek New Testament. Now, the reason why their Greek New Testament was popular at that time, you had a lot of introductions written in Latin or German, but they did their introduction in English. And that's why it was so popular. They printed Greek New Testament. It was a departure, a complete break, and it became the modern Textus Receptus. Yeah. So the Westcott and Hort printed Greek New Testament. They didn't really add anything in terms of the canons or rules per se, but what you found was that their printed Greek New Testament was the foundation, the basis of our modern translation today, English translation today. And so that was their real impact, was the printed Greek New Testament. And the reason why it exploded and became very popular, most printed Greek New Testament before that, they would focus their introduction and how they went about what they went out in Latin or German or such like. But they did it as in English, and that's it became really popular, their printed New Testament. And that is the basis upon which Ionesso's Land was produced, or Ionesso's printed Greek New Testament. And so scholars will say today, modern scholars will say from 1881 up to present, there's very little difference between the printed Greek New Testament. Aland, all right, very influential, and I'd recommend their book, the Curtin Barbara Aland's Text of the New Testament. Really good book. In terms of in terms of the evidence and about modern textual criticism. But they sort of had their rules. There was, I think it was 12 rules. I've just taken a few out, but one that's interesting, it says only the reading best satisfies the requirements of both external and internal criteria can be original. So what they're looking at is the external manuscripts, which the focus would be the older. Now, one of the things that they believe was the older, the latter manuscripts were corrupted. So your earlier manuscripts were the ones that weight was supposed to be given. But the rule, what's known as rule number 9, was called variance must never be treated in isolation, but always considered in the context of the tradition. Otherwise, there's too great a danger of reconstructing a test tube text which never existed at any time or place. Now, this is interesting because what it's basically saying, and I'll give an example of that later on, probably in my next treatment of this, is that how the eclectic methodology is say, for example, you have a particular verse, they would look for the variant reading from one manuscript, say, for example, Codex Sinaiticus, and then a couple of words along, they look at another variant reading, and they look at, say, Codex Vaticanus, they look at another one, and then they say may look at another reading which is supported by, I don't know, Codex Beis. And what happens, the problem is when they come together, you end up overall with a particular verse with no manuscript support. And if you've got no manuscript support, you can't have any transmissional history. So overall, you can end up with a printed Greek Bible with no record in history of a manuscript supporting it. Okay. And they also supported the difficult reading. The more difficult reading is more probable because the scribes were more like to smooth it over. And the other one, the shorter reading. So they pushed that one as well. So let's look at an example of the internal criteria. So remember, we mentioned about Griesbach, where he mentioned about that even though something's evidently false, it's found to be true. So we use example of the genealogy, right, in Matthew. So it talks about the lineage of Jesus, and it mentions in modern versions, it would say, the ESV would say, Asaph. Now we know Asaph wasn't a king in Judah, it was actually Asa. Yeah, Asa was the king, right? And there's another one where it mentions Amos when it really should be Ammon, right? That's clearly an error. Now the interesting thing is that when you look at, say, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, is that not only they had the New Testament, they had the Old Testament in there as well. And I think they also had the Apocrypha as well. So, but the clear, correct reading of Asa and Ammon is found in the Old Testament part of the same Codex Vaticanus. But in the New Testament, it's got the wrong reading. That's clearly a scribal error. But the textual critics would go ahead and accept that reading. Why? Because it was supported by Codex Vaticanus. That's clearly an error. It's clearly an error, all right? So, but what the textual scholar would say, well, this was a mistake made by the apostles. I think they'd have to assume that it's a mistake made by the apostles because they believe this is a true reading, but it's clearly an error. But makes it even worse is that the same Codex Vaticanus, if you go into the Septuagint part, it has the correct reading of Asa and Ammon. All right. But what the modern textual scholar would say that scribes, even though it's an error, they would more likely correct the error later on, right? And it says 98% of manuscripts support the reading Asa, all right? Now, it's clearly an error, but because you're following the canon, this is where the issue with the Byzantine tradition and the modern textual tradition, because of the canon, you would now begin to introduce errors, because in your mindset, that if that the scribes would try and clear up any errors, all right? So, and that's why you find with the Byzantine tradition, you don't find canons or rules. What you will find is that there's a general agreement, and any sort of differences do not bring in these kind of errors. Okay. Shorter reading. Now, remember what I said before, there was no study done, recognized study done on scribal habits. And so there's no evidence for these particular canons in terms of the internal criteria. But since that time, since E.C. Cowell did one in 1965, you have James Roysce. We looked at 6 papyri, and he found that scribes omitted 79% to 29%. Maurice Robinson in Majuscules omitted, and he found that that scribes omitted 62% to 38%. Minuscules, which are the later sort of manuscripts, 60 to 40%. Juan Hernandez, I think he was looking at the Apocalypse, all right, looking at the major codex, and he found 60-40, very similar to Maurice Robinson, all right. Peter Head, He found in Pat Price 66% to 34%. All right. Andrew Wilson's, he did the one that said with 2,280, you can download that off the internet. He did the one, he's the only one actually went into through papyri, majuscules, minuscules, and I think he did lectionaries as well. So he found that papyri was 75 to 25%. Now, if you notice, it's very similar to James Roysce. Majuscules 60-40. Yeah. So if you look in terms of the majuscules, it's very similar to Juan Hernandez and Maurice Robinson. I believe it's Maurice Robinson, that was his doctoral dissertation, where he did on scribal habits. Minuscules, 62% to 38%. Very similar to Maurice Robinson's figures, all right? But all scribes, all have found scribes more likely to omit than add. Now, here's interesting. When you go to Bruce Metzger's text commentary, he would make decisions based on the shorter reading. Okay, let's go a bit further. Right, so here, this is the third canon, investigating the harder reading. So remember I said with Griesbach and Montet scholars, they talk about how, and this was the issue against the Byzantine tradition of manuscripts, was that their mindset was the scribe would smooth it over, make it nicer, but the rules favored the Alexandrian manuscripts, right? So the canons favored that and were against the Byzantine tradition manuscripts. So what he did, he took 2,280 readings covering 11 chapters and look at the harsher reading canon. So basically, remember, the scribes, what Griesbach and Hort and the others, they believed the scribe would smooth it over, but they looked into singular readings, right? So nonsense reading was 24%, harder sense was 11%, yeah? So basically, these singular readings would make it harder, all right? The harder style was 27%, neutral 30%, but to make it easier, this is the focus here, and this was the big issue against the Byzantine tradition, it was only 8%. So with the scribal habit, only 8%. To make it easier sense, only 0.4%. So what you find here is that there is no evidence for the canon, as possible. There's no evidence of the canon for modern textual critics. Okay? And there's no evidence to support, and nobody's actually gone out and done any research on scribal habits which support those readings. Okay, now what I will do, I'm going to finish now, but my next one will be the eclectic method, right? Variants must never be treated in isolation, right, in the Constitution. And I'm basically in my next session, which is part 3, will focus on how, even though this rule was brought in, how it's been broken time and time again. And in the end, you can have a printed Greek New Testament, which no manuscript looks like in terms of papyri or minuscules, majuscule, none. All right. And I'm going to look at not only just Matthew 19:28, but also other works as well. Okay. God bless you. May God keep you. And I hope you find you're learning something, or if you don't learn anything, that you're enjoying the video. Thanks. God bless you, and see you again soon.